All right. I don't know if you saw this or not, but basically there's a channel called Nick Tech. We've watched some of his videos before, and generally I like the comparisons. Just really good side-by-sides of like graphics comparisons. He's the one that did a lot of those videos that went viral looking at like Suicide Squad's graphics versus Batman Arkham Knight. And it's like these games are 9 years apart. And you know, those types of videos doing the side-by-side comparisons. And kind of taking the torch in some ways from Kroby Cat, because he only shows up every once in a while, every like year or two. But he posted a video that started one heck of a firestorm, and it was simply this clip. In case you were wondering, Mafia: The Old Country doesn't have swimming physics just like previous Mafia games. And people immediately, I mean, the comment section you can start looking through. Can you space travel in it? I don't understand why swimming is so important. Gangsters don't swim. There's something called design discipline. How dare they? There's no need for swimming physics in a Mafia game. A Don doesn't swim. And this is where it's kind of evolved to now. Initially, for the first couple of days, this was overrun with people being like, I cannot believe that they did this. This is absolute garbage. What a joke. It's a total disaster. They're lazy. They're undisciplined, all this. But pretty quickly, the pendulum swung the other way with people calling it out for being an unnecessary comparison, or maybe a disingenuous point of I guess, complaint. And in his defense, this post, in case you're wondering, it doesn't have swimming physics just like previous Mafia games. He's just saying something. Yeah, it doesn't have swimming physics. The implication, of course, is that it's bad because of this. That's what's sort of implied by making this post. It is like, let's be real. Let's be real. I like Nick Tech. It's a little bit of rage bait. Just a little. It's a little bit of rage bait. Let's not beat around the bush. That's what's happening here. And he follows up with further posts. Swimming is cut content. A user on Reddit, your boy got hit, found fully functional swimming physics in the definitive edition, where they actually had animations for the actual swimming, but they couldn't be used in like regular parts of the map, but you could sort of hard force it. Most likely just remnants of the controller and the code for the character, and you know, it's just manually turned off elsewhere. But you know, this type of thing has always been kind of stupid to me, because I'm like, okay, so you can't swim in Spider-Man games. Does that mean they're bad? You know, it doesn't hold. It doesn't really mean anything. And you can see the responses to these have been pretty universal on this. So actually, Tina Turl Tourist, I feel like I'm aging out of the gaming sphere, because I see this and ask myself, does this game even need swimming? Should dev time be devoted to it? And people in the comments are saying this is unacceptable for a 2025 game. I don't know. I just don't think games need every mechanic. And this is why I think this has gone sort of viral and people have talked about it so much, because throughout the whole 360, the whole PS4, Xbox One era, even in the early PS5 era, things have been overwhelmed with this idea that games have to be AAA across the board, both in price, but then also if they're in a big name franchise, they need to be AAA in scope, scale, otherwise they're bad. And this is what's often compared, where we look at, and it's usually the giveaway that maybe we're being a little unfair, is when we start to do side-by-side comparisons with things that are not the same. Like if you're comparing a linear narrative game to an open world adventure game, there are going to be differences. There's going to be differences in animation quality. There's going to be differences in cutscene quality. There's going to be differences across the board in all of these things. One exception probably being Rockstar games. Like Red Dead looks amazing even now, despite being open world. It's still fantastic. That's going to be true always. Rockstar is just almost always the exception to the rule. But, you know, just because you can find a side-by-side to say, hey, this linear game from 5-6 years ago looks better than this open world game from this month, that doesn't necessarily mean that this game from this month is bad. Maybe it's not as impressive visually as the game from back then, or animation wise. It doesn't mean that this game needs to be discarded and thrown away, right? Not every game needs to be a gigantic AAA behemoth that has every single feature you could imagine. And this is something that also was kind of funny, because it was brought up with one of the devs from Larian, of course. You've seen him, no doubt. Very AFK, Cromwelp. He replied to this and said, "This reminds me of when we showed Baldur's Gate 3 to someone, an executive or whatever. a wealth of mechanics, and with zero emotion, the executive just goes, "Can you swim in the game?" Like, bro, this isn't a mechanical whack-a-mole. Endlessly layering mechanics make it a good game not. Exactly. Like, you can have an amazing game where you can't swim, and it's okay. You can have an amazing game where maybe it doesn't even have a branching narrative. Can you imagine? And that's okay. Maybe it doesn't have endless open world activities. And that's okay. Not every game needs to be an open world game. And my stance for a long time has been, if you can't do something well, often it's best just to not do it at all. If you can't do the open world formula well, maybe it's best just to not do it. If you can't come up with ways to keep the player engaged in a massive open world that's unique, dynamic, and interesting, maybe just don't do it. If you can't have 1,000 different planets to land on and make that interesting in terms of a gameplay loop, maybe don't put 1,000 goddamn planets in your game. Maybe do 1 or 2, dare I say. But if you can't do it well, maybe just don't do it at all. And Mafia: The Old Country is a game which is very transparent in the fact that it is not doing everything. It will not try to fill the open world with a ton of dynamic encounters, with tons of side quests for you to go and, bounce around all over the map, with a reputation system, with tons of branching dialogue choices and stuff. It doesn't try to do that. That's not the kind of game it is. It is trying to be a linear narrative game in a big map that they will also let you drive around and explore if you want to, but that's not the core of the game. The core of the game is to tell a story with interesting writing and characters and pretty solid set pieces. And in that pursuit, I think it does a pretty damn good job. But there's plenty of gamers out there that have gotten accustomed to this idea that if a game is not a Rockstar level gargantuan monstrosity, therefore it's bad. And that's where the riskiness can come in, where you'll just start to realize you're not enjoying anything. You can never have fun, because anytime you play anything, you're like, well, it's not as good as this masterpiece. Yeah. And it's also the other side of this too, is that, Metacritic scores are usually a pretty good indication of overall quality or consensus quality from critics, of course. 10 out of 10 games, absolutely you should play. 9 out of 10s, very often you should play. 7 to 8 out of 10 can still be well worth your time. But for some reason, it feels like right now, if a game is not a 9 or a 10, it's bad or it's disappointing. It's like, what game was it? There was one game recently where it got a Metacritic score in the high 80s, and a studio congratulated the studio for the successful launch and for the good reviews. Congrats on the awesome reviews. And it was a game in the 80s, high 80s, I think, in Metacritic. And people were replying to that post saying, are you really proud of an 86 on Metacritic? What are we doing? What are you talking about? That's a good score. That's a very good score. Do you have any idea how hard it is to get a Metacritic score above 80, period? What are we doing? That's a very good score. And, whenever you have these discussions, I think maybe the crucial bit is to ask yourself, is this just the gaming sphere on X? Is this just the gaming sphere on social media? Do average gamers really care? Does an actual person who just wants a good game really care? And they might not. But where I think it can have an impact is in the realm of peer pressure and word of mouth. That can absolutely harm a game's potential for success. If you have a game that is really solid, but has really bad word of mouth, you know what you get? You end up with one of the most underrated games of the last decade, in my opinion. And I have a feeling a lot of you guys will agree with this as well. Guardians of the Galaxy. Guardians of the Galaxy, the game, is so unbelievably underrated. It's ridiculous. It is so impressive. Just every element of it is polished, is refined. Everything from the team hype sessions to the combat, which is pretty solid and engaging as well. The story is really impressively well done as well. Set pieces are massive and interesting. It's a really, really good game, but it had really bad word of mouth at launch because everybody thought it was going to be another Marvel's Avengers game, which was a live service disaster in its own right. And so it didn't have good word of mouth, and the game unfortunately flopped as a result. And I believe Square Enix said it was a significant miss from their projections and their targets. And it's too bad, because this was a game that should have been rewarded with overwhelming success. It really should have, in my opinion. It was just that good. This animation wasn't, but everything else, everything else, very, very good. Very good. And if you can play this today, you absolutely should. But word of mouth can, you know, help a game explode in popularity. It can also really hurt it if it's not given the time of day. And then the Wooster, thank you for that one. Couldn't you make the argument that with increasing game prices, this in turn would make consumers demand more from their products? If you could only afford a few games per year, consumers want the most bang for their buck. Absolutely, but I think bang for your buck, also you got to ask, what's that standard? Is it quality or is it quantity? For some gamers, it's quantity. They just want more. They want 1,000 hours of game time, and if they don't get it, it wasn't worth their time and money. Other people just want high quality. Some maybe want both, but I think it depends on what you're looking for. Ultimately, I think for most people, it's quality. They understand if they're getting a really, really good 15 hours, that's better than a mediocre 50, you know? But I think that is perhaps fair to bring up. But even with like a Mafia example, we're talking about a game that's $50 instead of a full $70 release. And it still is like a 12 to 15 hour game, depending on how much exploration and collectible stuff you want to do. It's a solid length. But again, like I feel like over the last decade, we've gotten conditioned to the point where it feels as though if a game is not a 40, 50 hour game, people automatically hand wave it away as too short. And if it doesn't have a lot of these massive open world features or just sheer volume of content features, it's also therefore unacceptable or bad. And that causes a lot of these games that are in that like 8 out of 10 range that are good, like solid B- or B grade games, they just never stand a chance because we're like, whatever. But it's also perhaps, you know, it's just a broader reflection on the industry. People don't have as much money and competition is higher than it's ever been. So people are going to be selective, and there's that. But at the very least, you know, people are looking at it and people are responding to this discourse. Pretty at this point, I feel like the response has been overwhelming. And like this one, I didn't realize it was up here. 99,000 likes. I feel like people are standing up and being like, no, I'm happy with this. Not every game needs swimming. You know, the game isn't bad because it lacks swimming. You know, it's not fair to dismiss it because of that. I'm not saying Nick Tech was trying to dismiss the game because it lacks swimming. I personally think this was a little bit of rage bait. I think Nick knows what he's doing. I think he's rage baiting a little bit. We do a little trolling. But I think the response has shown pretty clearly that gamers, at least a lot of them, are starting to be like, you know what? It doesn't actually matter. Very AFK followed this up. The realities of game design are such that each feature has a cost: manpower, time, budget. Why not just can set a producer on fire? Try it. It's funny. Better to not swim if you're not going to do anything with it than to add it simply to have it. Exactly. Like just having it so somebody can check off a box doesn't really make sense. It just doesn't. The hitherto most common version of this is when a dev shows a game and the first question is there a day-night cycle? I'm convinced many day-night cycles exist to save PR people from murder charges. That's funny. I think, you know, and to be clear, there are some games where perhaps it is fair to bring this up and it is fair to question it. Like, is it fair to ask day-night cycle? Let's go with that. Day-night cycle in something like AC Shadows. It has a day-night cycle because the game is called AC Shadows, and it's useful in the gameplay for them to cycle between day and night. That just makes sense, right? In a different game, like, what would an example be? Expedition 33. Does that need a day-night cycle? No, it doesn't. The game would not be better. I think if it did have a day-night cycle, most people would not notice or care. I don't think it would matter, you know, because it just doesn't have an impact on the game that they're producing, that they're making. So it doesn't make sense to spend the resources to do it. Does Undertale, or like, what would another, like, even more ridiculous? Does chess need a day-night cycle? You know, like, no, of course not. Don't be stupid. Yeah, at different times in the game's runtime, the lighting changes. It's chess. Shut up. Who cares? Like, what are we doing? What are we doing? Anyway, this started a whole discussion and a whole debate over the whole thing. It's very, very interesting. Nick Tech followed this up. Update, Mafia the Old Country does have swimming mechanics built in game. When you jump in deep water, Enzo goes back to shore and you can see he is indeed swimming. The devs clearly thought of this feature, added it, and decided it's best to not include it by design choice, just like Mafia Definitive Edition. In my case here, I was wondering if it's possible to swim. I didn't try jumping straight into deep waters, but instead tried to gradually go deeper, hitting an invisible wall. I see nothing wrong with not having swimming physics. My expectations when playing this game was to compare it to previous Mafia games, some of which were open world and had swimming physics, but this is a linear game by design and choice. The expectations are set properly, and I still believe $50 for this game is an incredible value after some stuttering issues are ironed out on PC. And I think, this also kickstarted a discussion. I'm glad that he followed up with this and answered more clearly what he thinks of it. But I think that this also, people call this Krabby Cat syndrome, where there's this desire to look at like a game and compare it and then therefore dismiss the new one because it doesn't match one-to-one. It's like sometimes things are cut, sometimes things are changed in pursuit of other things. And that's just what you're doing when you're making a game, is that you're constantly figuring out what we should put effort into, what we shouldn't. And the whole problem of this generation has been that budgets are out of control and prices for players have gotten out of control, even to the point where giga corporations like Microsoft, $4 trillion companies, are having to step back their pricing, go back from 80 as they initially announced for Outer Worlds 2 and go back and say, okay, we'll only charge 70 because the reaction was so strong against that. Players are just fed up with the price hikes, and scope is so out of control that these games are freakishly expensive to make. And the only way you really get that fixed, I don't think you can endlessly raise prices. Gamers only have so much money, and we've seen that even with the response from Microsoft walking back the price hike. So now I think what you're saying is, okay, how else do we change it? How else do we fix the equation? Because if we can't raise prices here, we have to lower the cost here, and we got to cut some costs by making smaller games, by not trying to turn everything into the next Assassin's Creed or Red Dead or GTA, and being tighter with the scopes, and maybe not try to turn everything into a massive quadruple A monstrosity. Maybe you start smaller with like a double A experience that's a little tighter, a little more refined, a smaller dev team that's really passionate, and you give them plenty of time to work on it instead of having 2,000 devs work on something for a year and a half, So I think that this is, a good indication. The passionate response to this initial post, I think it shows that the industry more broadly is healing in a way from this trend that was so prominent during the 2010s. And gamers are now much more open to tighter experiences, because games like Mafia the Old Country used to be very, very common, especially back in like the 360 PS3 era. There were a lot of these tighter budget, tighter scoped games that didn't try to do everything. They were just trying to do what they were trying to do and nothing more, nothing less. But they kind of died out, especially in the age of the blockbusters on PS4. And now it looks like players are open to it because of products like Game Pass, which make them much more palatable, I think, just to give them a shot. But even with Mafia the Old Country, which is, as far as I know, not on any of those services, players are still interested and open to it. So I'm here for it, because I would like more games like Mafia the Old Country. This is like exactly the kind of package I like. It's 12 hours long. It's not ridiculously oversized and bloated with tons of garbage. And it's like, hey, we know how to do a story well. We know how to do cinematics well and set pieces well. Let's do that. That's our game. And they just do that well. Yeah. Does the combat and stealth work amazingly well? No, not really. But it's good enough to service what they are really good at. And then it's also a package that's discounted and is at a cheaper price point. And I think we need more of that, frankly. Better water physics than Starfield. At least it has a map at launch. I'll give you that. Yeah, I like smaller packages, Taylor. Exactly. And if you guys are here on the stream today, you probably do too. Because you're watching me. Sadness. Jesus.